In the beginning, after the great flood, the descendants of Noah began to spread out and settle across the earth. Among Noah's 3 sons was Ham, and from him came several nations. One of Ham's sons was named Canaan. The Bible provides this record in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, which says, "And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan." Canaan would go on to become the father of many descendants, and these descendants would eventually form the tribes and peoples who would live in the region that became known as the land of Canaan. Canaan's family line continued to grow and spread. Genesis chapter 10, verse 15 through verse 19 tells us, "And Canaan begat Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite, and afterward were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, even unto Lasha." These names may seem unfamiliar today, but they represented powerful people groups and kingdoms at that time. They lived across a wide stretch of land, from the coastal cities like Sidon to the southern regions near Gaza, and over to the infamous areas of Sodom and Gomorrah. This land, occupied by the descendants of Canaan, would eventually be known as Canaan itself. It was not a single nation, but a collection of tribes and fortified cities. The Jebusites, Amorites, Hivites, and others each had their territories, customs, and rulers. These were the people that future generations of Israelites would encounter and often clash with as the Bible's story continued. But even at this early point, before the birth of the nation of Israel, the land was already filled with Canaan's descendants, and their presence was deeply rooted. One of the earliest moments where this land is highlighted in a divine promise takes place when God calls Abram, who would later be known as Abraham. The Lord led him into this very land, already filled with the Canaanites. Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 and verse 7 tells us, "And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there built he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him." Even while the land was already occupied, God was declaring his plan. That moment marked the beginning of a promise. God told Abram that his descendants would one day inherit the land. It wasn't to happen right away. Canaan's people were still strong and numerous, but it was a promise set in motion. The land that Abram walked through was not empty. It was full of life, power, and culture. Yet God's word looked far ahead into the future, beyond the present strength of the Canaanites, to what he had in store for Abram's lineage. As time passed, God revealed more about this promise. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 18 through verse 21, the Lord gives Abram a clearer picture of the land and its current inhabitants. The scripture says, "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. The Canaanites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites." The land was large and filled with strong nations. These were not empty places waiting to be taken. They were occupied by real people with cities and armies. Yet even so, God declared that this territory would belong to Abram's descendants. This land eventually came to be called the Promised Land, not because of anything the people did to earn it, and not simply because of its beauty or resources, but because God had spoken a promise. That promise became the foundation for everything that would follow. Though the land remained in the hands of the Canaanites for many generations, and though the Israelites were not yet a people, God's word had already gone forth. During the lifetime of Abraham, the Canaanites were still very present in the land. Abraham lived among them, moved through their regions, and even interacted with some of their leaders. At that stage in the story, there was no war between them, just the quiet presence of one man carrying a divine promise. But this would not always be the case. As the generations unfolded, the relationship between Abraham's descendants and the Canaanites would change. For now, the Bible shows us a land full of people, cities, and strength, yet with an invisible promise hovering over it, like a seed planted, waiting for its time to grow. The Canaanites were not only known in the Bible as a group of tribes that inhabited the land, but they also became symbols of a culture and lifestyle that stood in deep contrast to God's holiness. As time passed, the ways of the Canaanite people grew darker and more offensive in the eyes of God. Long before Israel would take possession of the land, God already knew the spiritual condition of the Canaanites. Their way of life had become marked by practices that went beyond mere differences in custom. They were rooted in corruption and rebellion. One of the clearest explanations comes from the book of Leviticus, where God warned the Israelites about the lifestyle of the people who lived in Canaan before them. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 24 through verse 30 says, "Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. That the land spew not you out also, when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you." This passage reveals the depth of what was happening in the land before the Israelites ever entered. It was not only that the Canaanites were morally corrupt, but their sins had reached such a level that God described the land itself as reacting against them. The kinds of actions referred to in this chapter include deeply disturbing behaviors, sexual sins of all kinds, the practice of sacrificing children in fire to their gods, and complete spiritual rebellion. These were not isolated behaviors among a few people. They had become part of the everyday culture, embedded in the religious systems and in family life. The gods the Canaanites worshipped, like Molech and Baal, required extreme forms of devotion. In some of their rituals, parents would offer their children burnt offerings, believing it would bring blessings or favor from their gods. These were not symbolic gestures. They were real, horrific acts that caused unimaginable pain and loss. In the book of Deuteronomy, God explains again why He is allowing Israel to take over the land. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4 and verse 5 says, "Speak not thou in thine heart. After that the Lord thy God hath cast them out from before thee, saying, For my righteousness the Lord hath brought me in to possess this land. But for the wickedness of these nations the Lord doth drive them out from before thee. Not for thy righteousness or the uprightness of thine heart dost thou go to possess their land, But for the wickedness of these nations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This makes it clear. Israel did not earn the land by their goodness. The judgment against the Canaanites was already settled because of the overwhelming sin they had embraced. God's justice moved to act, and Israel became part of that plan. The Canaanite world was more than just morally broken. There are mysterious and strange references in the Bible that add another layer to their story, particularly regarding the presence of giants. When Moses sent 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan, they came back terrified. Not only did they report that the land was fruitful and rich, but they also described a kind of people unlike any they had seen before. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33 says, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." The use of the word giants here points to something more than just tall individuals. These were described as the sons of Anak, also called the Anakim. In other parts of the Bible, the Rephaim and Anakim are mentioned alongside them, tribes or clans known for their great size and strength. Some scholars and readers connect these groups to an earlier mention found in Genesis, where it says that in the days before the flood there were giants on the earth. These are referred to as the Nephilim in some translations, believed to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, though this interpretation is debated. Still, the Bible makes it clear that something unusual and fearsome continued into the post-flood world. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 10 and verse 11 says, "The Amims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, which also were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Amims." These beings were not mythical in the eyes of the people living in that time. They were real, terrifying, and dominant in their territories. The fear that spread among the Israelite spies wasn't simply about military strength. It was about facing something larger, both physically and spiritually. In another passage, the Rephaim are mentioned in connection to the land of Bashan, ruled by King Og. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11 says, "For only Og king of Bashan remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man." Again, we see references to beings who stood out from normal human strength and size. The Bible doesn't spend many verses giving detailed explanations of their origins at this point, but it does show that the land of Canaan was home to many such figures. The presence of these giants among the Canaanite tribes added another layer of fear, especially for the Israelites who were just beginning their journey into the land. These giants may have seemed like invincible warriors, but they were still part of a system and culture that was deeply evil and defiant toward the God of Israel. They represented not only physical opposition, but spiritual rebellion. The land had become home to a people whose practices and power had reached a place that called for divine action. This is why the conquest of Canaan was not presented as a random military campaign. It was framed as a divine judgment on a people whose sins had polluted everything around them. The land was rich, yes, but it had also become defiled by violence, bloodshed, and demonic worship. The Israelites were not only walking into a new homeland, they were stepping into a spiritual battlefield, where the past had left scars that only God could remove. The story of the Canaanites in connection to the patriarchs becomes more personal during the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These early fathers of Israel were not just traveling through the land. They were living among the people, dealing with them, making agreements, and sometimes experiencing tension. When God called Abraham out of his homeland, he led him into the land of Canaan. But even though God promised this land to him, Abraham never actually possessed it during his lifetime. He lived as a foreigner, surrounded by cities, kings, and people who already had structured ways of life. One of the earliest moments where we see how Abraham related to the Canaanites was during the death of his wife Sarah. Needing a burial site, Abraham didn't force his way into land ownership, even though he had a divine promise. Instead, he approached the sons of Heth, a Canaanite group, and asked to purchase a burial place. Genesis chapter 23 tells us how Abraham bowed before the local people and respectfully requested the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite. The conversation between them was formal and courteous, and Ephron eventually agreed to sell the field. This event matters because it shows Abraham's integrity. Though he was promised the land, he waited on God and lived honorably, purchasing the first piece of land through peaceful agreement, not conflict. As Abraham continued living among the Canaanites, some interactions were peaceful, while others brought conflict. Genesis chapter 14 tells the story of a major war between several kings. These weren't small tribal leaders, these were kings ruling over cities and regions, showing how advanced and organized Canaanite society already was. In the middle of this conflict, Abraham's nephew Lot was taken captive. Abraham acted quickly, gathered his trained men, and pursued the attackers. He defeated them, rescued Lot, and recovered everything that was taken. After this, Abraham met Melchizedek, king of Salem, a city many believe to be ancient Jerusalem. Melchizedek is a mysterious figure in the Bible called the priest of the Most High God, and he blessed Abraham. This moment is powerful because it reveals that even in a land filled with idol worship, there were individuals who still honored the true God. Isaac, Abraham's son, had his own set of encounters with the people in the region. Though his life was less dramatic, Isaac still faced conflict, especially over water rights. Genesis chapter 26 shows how Isaac reopened the wells that his father had dug, only to find himself in disputes with the herdsmen of Gerar. These arguments over wells may seem minor, but they reflected deeper tensions over resources and territory. Eventually, the local king came to Isaac and made peace, recognizing that God was clearly with him. Even in times of tension, the Canaanite rulers respected the divine blessing on Isaac's life and wanted to maintain peace with him. Jacob, the son of Isaac, also lived among the Canaanites, and his experience brought moments of both interaction and tragedy. After returning to Canaan from years of living with Laban, Jacob settled near the city of Shechem. It was here that something devastating happened. His daughter Dinah went out to visit the local women, and Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, saw her and violated her. Afterward, he wanted to marry Dinah and asked Jacob for her hand. Jacob's sons, full of anger, pretended to agree but later attacked the city. They killed the men and looted their possessions. This violent act struck fear in the surrounding communities, and Jacob himself was afraid that the local people might come together to take revenge. The event showed just how fragile the peace was between Jacob's family and the surrounding towns. What looked calm on the surface could quickly collapse under pressure. The Canaanites during the time of the patriarchs were not just scattered families. They had kings, fortified cities, armies, and deeply rooted traditions. Some relationships with them were peaceful, some were respectful, and others were filled with tension or danger. But one thing remained constant: the spiritual difference between the people of God and the culture of the land. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each built altars of the Lord in places filled with idols and false gods. They were living in a land that had not yet been spiritually changed, and they had to trust in God's promises even when they saw no visible sign of fulfillment. As the generations passed and the Israelites prepared to enter the land under Moses and Joshua, the Bible became even more detailed about the strength of the Canaanite world. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 1 gives a list of the peoples they would face. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. This was not going to be an easy entrance. These nations were powerful and well established. The land was filled with cities, each guarded and fortified. Later in the book of Joshua, we are given a list of the kings who ruled different areas of Canaan. Joshua chapter 12 records that Israel defeated 31 kings. Each of these kings had their city or region, which means the land was not under one ruler, but a network of independently governed strongholds. Archaeological findings from places like Jericho and Hazor support this, revealing large cities with defensive walls and complex layouts. The Israelite spies described the cities as being walled up to heaven, a phrase that showed how impossible it all seemed from a human perspective. These kings were not only political figures, they were also deeply tied to the religious life of their people. The worship in their cities was centered on false gods, many of whom demanded practices that were violent and evil. So when God commanded Israel to take these cities, it wasn't just about territory. It was about breaking down systems of darkness and replacing them with the worship of the one true God. One example is the fall of Jericho, where the walls came down not through siege weapons, but through the power of God. That victory was more than military. It was spiritual. It was a declaration that the God of Israel was now establishing his presence in a land that had long resisted him. Even so, not all Canaanites stood against Israel. Some individuals saw the truth and turned toward the God of Israel. One of the most memorable was Rahab of Jericho. Though she lived in a city under judgment, she chose to hide the Israelite spies and asked for mercy. She believed in the power of Israel's God, and her life was spared. She even became part of Israel's future. Her story shows that even when entire cities were falling, individuals still had the chance to choose God. The Canaanite kings and cities were strong, advanced, and spiritually resistant. The land was not waiting to be taken. It was filled with life, culture, and systems that opposed God's ways. But from the time of Abraham to the days of Joshua, God had been preparing his people. The journey of the patriarchs showed that the promises of God were not forgotten. Even in a land full of opposition, those promises were quietly taking root, waiting for the right moment to bloom into reality. When the children of Israel finally reached the edge of the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, the long-awaited fulfillment of God's promise to their ancestors stood just ahead. But it was not going to be handed over without resistance. The land of Canaan was still full of strong cities, skilled warriors, and fortified defenses. God's instruction to Joshua was not to make peace with the Canaanite nations, but to drive them out completely. The time of mercy for those cities had ended. Their sins had reached their full measure, and now judgment was coming. Joshua was not just leading a military campaign, he was carrying out divine justice on a land that had long defied the authority of God. The first major city to be conquered was Jericho. God did not use traditional warfare to take it down. Instead, he gave Joshua specific instructions that highlighted the power of obedience and faith. The people of Israel were told to march around the city once a day for 6 days and 7 times on the 7th day, with priests blowing trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant at the center. Joshua chapter 6 records how the walls of Jericho collapsed after the final shout on the 7th day. This miraculous victory set the tone for what was to come. It showed Israel that their success would not depend on numbers or weapons, but on complete dependence on God's voice. After Jericho, the campaign moved swiftly. Cities like Ai, Hebron, Lachish, and Hazor fell. Many of the kings of the land gathered together to resist Israel, forming coalitions in hopes of pushing back the invasion. But Joshua led Israel from battle to battle, and the Lord gave them victory. Joshua chapter 10 describes a remarkable event where Joshua prayed to God, and the sun stood still so that Israel could complete their victory against the Amorite kings. This moment was not only a sign of God's power over nature, but also a demonstration of how seriously he was moving through his people to bring down the structures that had stood in opposition for generations. By the end of these campaigns, Joshua had defeated many kings and taken control of large parts of the land. Joshua chapter 12 provides a full list of the kings who were conquered, numbering over 30. Each of these kings ruled a city that had once represented Canaanite pride and strength. Now they had been brought down. The land was beginning to shift under the weight of God's judgment and Israel's obedience. However, as the fighting slowed and the land was divided among the tribes of Israel, something began to happen that would later cause great trouble. Though many of the Canaanite strongholds had been defeated, not all of the people were driven out. The task was not yet fully complete, but Israel started to settle in their allotted territories. The danger of this decision would not be seen immediately, but it would slowly grow over time. The book of Judges begins by explaining how some tribes did not fully obey God's command to remove the Canaanites from their territories. Judges chapter 1 gives account after account of cities and regions where the Israelites allowed the Canaanites to remain. Some were forced into labor, others were simply tolerated, and some areas were never conquered at all. This failure was not just a strategic error, it was disobedience. God had not told them to negotiate or make peace. He had clearly instructed that these nations be removed because of their wickedness and the spiritual danger they posed. Judges chapter 2, 1 through verse 3, speaks of how the angel of the Lord came and addressed the people, saying, I made you go up out of Egypt, and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars. But ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. This warning made it clear that their incomplete obedience would lead to ongoing pain and spiritual compromise. The Canaanites who remained among the Israelites did not simply fade into the background. They kept their customs, their altars, their idols, and their influence. Over time, Israel began to mingle with them, intermarry, and adopt their religious practices. The purity and calling that had once set Israel apart began to erode. Altars to Baal and Asherah poles started appearing even within the land that God had given to His people. What had once been a land promised for holiness and worship of the one true God was now shared with the very systems that He had wanted to be removed. The incomplete conquest had long-term effects not only on the physical control of the land, but also on the hearts of the people. Instead of standing separate and holy, Israel began to resemble the nations around them. The idols of the Canaanites did not remain as forgotten statues. They became stumbling blocks for future generations. Their stories would come up again and again in the cries of the prophets and the judgments that followed. God had given Israel everything they needed to succeed. He had gone before them in battle, shown them His power, and laid out the instructions. Yet their partial obedience opened a door that never fully closed. The Canaanites who were left behind became a living reminder of what happens when God's people stop short of complete trust. These remaining nations, though weakened, would later grow into thorns and snares, just as God had said. The conquest under Joshua was bold, powerful, and deeply tied to the promises and commands of God. It marked a high point of faith and courage, but the incomplete conquest revealed a human tendency to settle too early, to compromise when things become comfortable, and to lose the sharp edge of obedience. These chapters in Israel's story are not just about battles and borders. They are about what happens when God's people take part of His word seriously, but not all of it. The Canaanites, though broken in battle, were not fully removed, and their presence would shape the future in ways that Israel never imagined. The spiritual influence of the Canaanites on the people of Israel became one of the most serious and ongoing challenges in the entire Old Testament. Even after the days of conquest under Joshua had ended and long after the land had been divided among the tribes, the temptations that came from the Canaanite religious systems never truly left. The danger wasn't only found in warfare or politics, it was hidden in the slow fading of pure worship and heartfelt devotion. God had warned His people again and again. If the Canaanites were not completely removed, their ways would eventually lead Israel far away from Him. These warnings were not given out of mere caution. They came from a place of love and deep concern, designed to protect the hearts and future of the people. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, God gave very direct instructions to the Israelites about how they were to deal with the nations living in Canaan. Verses 2 through 5 say, "Thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. But thus shall ye deal with them. Ye shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire." These were not light suggestions, they were commands. The instructions covered everything from their relationships to their places of worship, calling for a complete tearing down of anything tied to false gods. But despite how clear the instructions were, Israel didn't fully carry them out. Over time, the Canaanite religion stayed alive in areas where the people were allowed to remain. The spiritual atmosphere of the land didn't change as it should have. Instead, it began to influence the very people who were called to be different. One of the major elements of Canaanite religion was the worship of Baal and Asherah. Baal was considered a storm god, and worship of him often involved sacrifices and immoral sexual practices. Asherah was tied to fertility, and her worship involved carved poles and sacred trees set up in high places. These things were not hidden in dark corners. They were out in the open, eventually becoming familiar sights in Israelite communities. The people didn't destroy these forms of worship. They started to mix them with their devotion to God, blending the holy with the unclean. This exact issue had been foreseen. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 12 through verse 16, God had already said, "Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. For thou shalt worship no other God. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." But instead of taking heed, Israel drifted. They built high places that were never meant to exist. They celebrated feasts that honored gods who were not the Lord. What had once been a strong warning slowly became a reality, as generation after generation moved further from what God had commanded. With time, the influence of Canaanite worship didn't just touch individuals, it began to shape the entire nation. Kings in Israel, especially those ruling in the northern kingdom, openly encouraged idol worship. One of the clearest examples is King Ahab. He married Jezebel, a woman from a Canaanite background, who didn't just introduce Baal worship, she enforced it across the land. Prophets like Elijah had to stand boldly against this dark tide. Elijah's challenge to the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel wasn't just a dramatic story. It was a head-on confrontation between the living God and the gods that had crept in from the Canaanite religion. Even in the southern kingdom of Judah, where faithfulness to God would sometimes return, the influence remained. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah led powerful reforms. They destroyed the high places, tore down the wooden images, and burned the altars that had been built for false gods. These efforts showed that revival was possible, but they also revealed how deeply the Canaanite influence had sunk in. What had started with a few compromises had grown into a full-blown spiritual crisis. The prophets who spoke to Israel in these times didn't hold back. They described the situation in powerful, emotional language. Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel often used the picture of unfaithfulness in marriage to describe Israel's relationship with God. They said the people had abandoned their first love and gone after gods who never truly cared for them. These were not just emotional cries. They were holy indictments against a people who had forgotten the very one who brought them out of Egypt. The gods that now filled the land had once filled it with evil, and now those same practices were repeating themselves among God's chosen nation. Even in the later prophetic writings, when Israel's history had stretched across centuries, the term Canaanite still carried heavy meaning. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 21 says, "Yea, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts. And in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts." By then the term Canaanite was no longer just about ethnicity or geography. It had become a symbol. It represented anything unholy, any system, belief, or influence that did not belong in the house of God. The idea of the Canaanite was now tied to impurity, to spiritual defiance, and to the things that corrupted the sacred. This lasting symbolism tells us something deeper. The story of the Canaanites and Israel was never only about conquering land or defeating armies. At its heart, it was about worship. It was about whether God's people would stay devoted or be pulled into patterns that led to destruction. The challenge was always to remain separate, not in distance, but in heart. And even when the political power of the Canaanites had vanished, their influence still lingered, shaping decisions, building altars, and calling people away from the covenant. In the end, the greatest battle between Israel and the Canaanites was never just about borders or cities. It was a spiritual battle for loyalty. God had longed for a people who would worship Him alone, who would reflect His holiness in a land He had given them. But the influence of Canaanite religion, allowed to remain through partial obedience, became a trap that shaped the soul of the nation. But the influence of Canaanite religion, allowed to remain through partial obedience, became a trap that shaped the soul of the nation. And through all of it, the story stood as a lasting lesson about what happens when compromise replaces obedience, and when the voice of God is no longer the loudest one in the land. This brings us to the end of the video. If anything we shared was unclear or left you with questions, feel free to drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. If this video helped you understand God's Word better, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. It really helps get the message out to more people. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming biblical teachings. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, may God bless you richly.